All right, this is Openstax U.S. History, Chapter 15, Section 4, the Union Triumphant. So, during the course of the war, one thing that the Confederacy sought to do was to gain recognition from a foreign power, namely either Great Britain or France. We might say Confederacy wanted foreign support. However, during the course of the war, neither Britain or France would turn out to support the Confederacy. France used the Civil War as somewhat of a distraction for them to try to increase their own land holdings in North America. France invaded Mexico while the United States was busy at war. So we might say of Mexico that France invaded while the U.S. was occupied in the war. So again, France really wasn't looking to support the Confederacy. Great Britain, on the other hand, did have some reason to support the South. A lot of the cotton from the South went to Great Britain. Great Britain and the United States had had a troubled history. They were industrial rivals. In fact, the British even built some ironclads for the Confederacy. An ironclad is an iron ship. Since the Confederates couldn't build their own, Britain built the South these ships, and they were effective for the South, or for the Confederacy. These ironclads that were built in Britain. However, it was ultimately the issue of slavery that caused the British to hesitate to the point to never actually officially endorsing the South. In fact, once the Emancipation Proclamation was issued, most of the British celebrated it. We have to recall that at this time, Britain had already abolished slavery. And for that reason, tended to support emancipation. And, this coupled with, the defeat by the Confederacy at the Battle of Gettysburg and the military success the Confederacy was no longer getting, the Confederacy never got the foreign support that they desired. Another thing that fundamentally changed with the Emancipation Proclamation was the use of African American or Black soldiers. We could say served in Union armies after the Emancipation Proclamation. Before that, the contrabands. Again, contrabands we talked about last section. That was the term given to slaves who were emancipated by Union armies, often, helped Union armies, providing manual labor and all sorts of other things. But once the Emancipation Proclamation was issued, there was really no reason as to why the North wouldn't use Black soldiers. So African American soldiers served in Union armies. Approximately 190,000 of them served during the course of the war. Probably the most famous Black division was the 54th Massachusetts Black Division. Probably became the most well-known. If you've ever seen the movie Glory, it's a movie about the 54th Massachusetts. But it also changed the way that, especially surrendering armies and POWs operated. The Confederacy, for their part, refused to take Black soldiers as hostages, or not as hostages, excuse me, as prisoners of war or POWs. And after the Emancipation Proclamation, the South also refused to trade POWs. A particularly infamous incident was that of Fort Pillow. Fort Pillow was a fort that was captured by the Confederate. I don't think he was a general, but certainly, maybe an officer, Confederate. We'll just call him officer. And at Fort Pillow, the captured African American forces, American or black troops, were murdered. And this became a huge outrage for the North that at Fort Pillow, Nathan Bedford Forrest would rather, or did rather, kill and murder surrendering black troops rather than taking them as POWs. And so after this point, the POW exchange, which Northerners and Southerners, engaged in during the course of the war, 1-for-1, was called off, and Northerners and Southerners were no longer exchanging prisoners of war. Finally, in the very end, or the sort of the last years of the war, 1864 to 1865, these years were very bloody. It was a war of attrition in which one side tried to wear down the other. By this time, Ulysses S. Grant had been given, command of forces in Virginia. Robert E. Lee was in command of forces for the Confederacy. And, they fought in 1864 and 1865 as Grant really relentlessly attacking Lee. And in many of these battles in the later stages of the war, the Union would lose, 2-1 compared to the Confederacy. So these were especially deadly battles for the Union. However, since the Union had the advantage, more soldiers, this was a winning strategy. So these Union soldiers just relentlessly attacked, suffered very high losses, very heavy casualties. But for every 2 soldiers that died for the Union, that 1 soldier that died for the Confederacy was harder to replace. In other words, this was not a sustainable strategy for the South. Brutal, deadly, some may even say cruel strategy for the North, but it was a winning strategy. Now, this was happening against the backdrop of the election of 1864, which was a presidential election. And in a lot of ways, the election would be determined by ultimately Union success or failure on the battlefield. It was ultimately the capture of Atlanta that tipped the election in favor of Lincoln. So Atlanta, this was a Confederate city captured by the Union. And we'll say it sealed Lincoln's re-election, right? Because once news of capture of Atlanta got to the North, Northerners were pretty confident that they would re-elect Lincoln and he would fight this war until its conclusion. Atlanta was captured by the Union General William Tecumseh Sherman. So we're going to say William Tecumseh Sherman, Union General. And he was responsible for invading the South. Following the capture of Atlanta, Sherman engaged in his what is referred to as his March to the Sea campaign. This was a Union campaign to destroy really any resource in the South. This included military and non-military targets. Sherman's March to the Sea campaign is typically interpreted or seen as just pure destruction. That is to take, destroy anything that could potentially be used to support the Southern war effort. So a lot of damage done physically to the South, especially in these later years. Like I mentioned before, that last election in 1864 in a lot of ways was sort of the last chance for the South to maybe get some sort of negotiated peace. Like we mentioned before, the North would never really run out of money or run out of men or run out of ammo. They would simply give up on the cause. There were many Northerners who wanted an end to the war. They were called Copperheads. So a Copperhead was an anti-war Northerner. And they found support behind George B. McClellan. Remember, McClellan was previously a Union general fired by Lincoln. He ran against Lincoln. Against Lincoln. And he called for an end to the war. And like we mentioned before, going into that election, there was a very real possibility and chance that Lincoln could have been beaten, right? The Emancipation Proclamation wasn't super popular. The North hadn't won a quick victory in the way that it imagined. Lincoln himself had, suspended habeas corpus. He was likened to a tyrant in this image here. But it ultimately was the victories on the battlefield, the success of General Grant, the capture of Atlanta that sealed Lincoln's reelection. Like we said, Lincoln reelected. And at that point, it really sort of sealed the deal for the Confederacy. It was only a matter of time. Appomattox Courthouse was the last battle in the Civil War. There, General Lee surrendered. To General Grant. General Lee pictured right here. General Grant pictured right here. And, once Lee surrendered to Grant, pretty much the rest of the Confederate war effort, fell apart and the war was effectively over. In total, the Civil War resulted in 600,000 combat deaths, making this the most deadly U.S. conflict in history. Meaning more Americans died in the Civil War than any other war the country's ever fought.